Hello, Internet. My name is S.K. Binicki. I'm a bird researcher, also known as an ornithologist, and an evolutionary biologist who studied cowbirds during my master's and my PhD research. Years ago, I found myself getting really frustrated with Facebook comments advocating for removing cowbird eggs from host nests in Kansas, where I lived at the time. So in 2019, I made a really long Twitter thread explaining why that was a really bad idea. In 2020, the Wichita Audubon Society invited me to turn that Twitter thread into a presentation for their club. You can still find that recording here on YouTube, but I've been updating this presentation for years now when I give it to birding clubs and birding festivals around the country. I haven't posted an updated version of the talk to YouTube, so I wanted to take the opportunity to do that. So without further ado, let's dive right in with this talk. Cowbird brood parasites. Are they villainous mobsters or a falsely maligned native species? If you would go on social media and talk about cowbirds like I do, like on the site formerly known as Twitter, you would see comments like this. That's a brown-headed cowbird, the most neglectful parents of the bird world. The sentiment is not new. Here's a children's book published in 1966 called Never Trust a Cowbird. Look at that cow giving the cowbird a side eye. If you search for brown-headed cowbirds on Google, you will see suggestions like this. People also ask, are cowbirds bad? Should you kill cowbirds? How do I get rid of cowbirds? This isn't only an academic question, as birders do take it into their own hands to kill cowbirds. This is an Audubon article asking, is it okay to remove cowbird eggs from host nests? It can be tempting to interfere with these brood parasites, but there are many reasons, legal and behavioral, to leave tampering to the pros. Why do cowbirds get so much hate, and is it deserved? Before I begin, let me reintroduce myself. I'm S.K. Winicki. Here's my contact information in case you want to send me your feedback or questions, and I'll post this again at the end of my presentation. As I said, I'm an ornithologist and a field biologist, so I'll be sharing photos of my work with living wild birds. Standard disclaimer, I have the training and legal permission to approach nests and handle these birds for my research. I do not recommend doing so without that training and permission. I'll be focused on cowbirds, but I will start by introducing brood parasitism more broadly. Then I will share cowbird facts to convince you that cowbirds are indeed villainous mobsters. And then I'll share facts to try to convince you that they're actually a falsely maligned native species. Regardless of the outcome of those two sections, I hope you will be intrigued by the final section where I share recent scientific advances made in researching cowbirds. I'm hoping to put little breaks in this recording so you can navigate to each section if you want to, but the arguments do build one into the other. When you hear the term parasites, what do you think of? Perhaps a blood-sucking insect or the critically acclaimed 2019 movie. Today, I'm discussing a very specific type of parasite called a brood parasite. These species rely on others to raise their young. Because I'm an ornithologist, I'll focus on birds, but the strategy also appears in insects and fishes. Here's a photo of fish nests. Some might contain brood parasite babies. Quick terminology note, the parasite is the species or individual that lays the eggs. The host is the species or individual that raises those eggs. There are multiple types of brood parasitism in birds. The most common strategy is what we call conspecific brood parasitism. Con means same, specific for species. This is a breeding strategy where a bird dumps her eggs in another bird's nest of the same species. This happens in many birds, possibly most bird species, but it is especially well known in ducks, such as these common goldeneye. Why might a bird lay her egg in another neighbor's nest? Well, predation is the #1 risk to breeding birds. Eggs and baby birds in nests are sitting ducks, vulnerable to roaming predators like this fox snake who is in the process of eating the baby robins that I had been studying in this nest. Conspecific brood parasitism allows laying birds to spread out that risk. They're putting their eggs in more baskets, so to speak, so that if a predator gets their own nest, some of their genetic babies might survive in the neighbor's nest. This is not a big problem for ducks and other species whose babies hatch well developed and don't need to be directly fed by the parents. In fact, it may be beneficial even if a bass fish is approaching this duck family to eat a baby, having a large flock filled with your neighbor's babies may mean that this female's her young are statistically less likely to be eaten. However, for altricial birds, the kind that hatch dependent on their parents for food, extra babies means having more mouths to feed, and caring for constantly begging nestlings is a lot of work. Despite this, we still see conspecific brood parasitism in altricial songbird species, suggesting that the benefits may outweigh the risks. If conspecific brood parasitism is common, heterospecific brood parasitism is decidedly less so. Hetero means different, specific means species. This is brood parasitism where a bird lays her eggs in the nest of a different species. Our North American yellow-billed cuckoos make their own nest and raise their own babies, but occasionally will also lay an egg in the nest of other species, like northern cardinals. This also spreads out the predation risk to the cuckoo's offspring, just like conspecific brood parasitism, but it now comes with the added risk that the host parents may not be well equipped to raise a baby of a different species. And that brings us to the final and most specific category, obligate heterospecific brood parasitism. These are species that have evolved to only lay their eggs in other species' nests, never building their own nest and raising their own babies. This breeding strategy has evolved at least 7 times, and I'll quickly walk you through an example of each of these groups. Black-headed ducks are a species of South American duck that lays their eggs in the nests of other ducks, but also gulls and coots. This is not a big problem for the host parents, as these ducklings are completely independent within 24 hours of hatching. Indigo birds, cuckoo finches, and whitas, on the other hand, are altricial songbirds. Their babies will depend on the host parents for care after they hatch. Hosts have evolved ways to avoid the parasitism of these finches so that they don't waste energy raising the costly altricious babies that aren't their own. For example, the host species known as the Prinia and the Cisticola have evolved variation in their egg coloration, seen here on the left, to help better distinguish their eggs from the parasite eggs. However, the parasitic cuckoo finches, seen here on the right, have evolved egg coloration that matches the host eggs. They're locked in what we call an evolutionary arms race, the host innovating over generations to better distinguish their eggs from the parasite, and the parasite innovating over generations to trick the host into raising their babies. This evolved mimicry doesn't stop with the eggs. The common waxbill host, seen here on the right, evolved fancy markings on the babies' beaks, presumably to better distinguish the parasite babies so the host could preferentially care for their own offspring. However, the parasitic whita on the left has evolved to match those too, which is really fascinating. Another neat group of obligate heterospecific brood parasites are the African honey guides. These birds have a very neat relationship with local humans. Over thousands of generations, the birds have learned to guide humans to beehives. When humans break open the hives to get the honey guide gets to eat the larva inside. While honey guides cooperate with humans, they do not cooperate with the host species that they parasitize. Baby honey guides hatch with these sharp hooks on the end of their beaks. Before they're Even able to open their eyes, they use these sharp hooks to kill the host eggs and nestlings in the nest, so only they receive the parental care. They're programmed to murder before they're even a day old. One of the largest and best known groups of obligate heterospecific brood parasites is the Old World cuckoos, with Old World just being an antiquated name for the Eastern Hemisphere. You may be familiar with images of tiny warbler hosts feeding these gigantic cuckoo babies. Like the cuckoo finches, cuckoos have evolved to mimic host eggs. In the first image, you can see drawings of the host eggs on the left and the matching common cuckoo eggs on the right. Some species have also evolved to mimic host chicks. You can see the hosts on the right and the matching cuckoo chick on the left. Some cuckoo species also take a honey guide-like approach to eliminating their competitors for parental care. However, unlike the honey guides that have these evolved beak hooks, cuckoos instead use their muscular wings and shoulders to push eggs and nestmates out of the nest, again, before they're even old enough to open their eyes. The New World cuckoos of the Western Hemisphere also include some obligate heterospecific brood parasites. Again, our North American cuckoos, like the yellow and black-billed cuckoos, are not obligate brood parasites, but this lovely pheasant cuckoo of Central America is. I could spend an entire talk talking about the neat evolutionary history and behavior of those other types of brood parasites, but let's get to our main story with cowbirds. Cowbirds are a group of Western Hemisphere blackbirds that have evolved obligate heterospecific brood parasitism, including our North American brown-headed cowbird. Some cowbird species are host-specific, like the screaming cowbird seen here in the middle, that typically only parasitizes the baywing, seen here on the left. That has allowed the screaming cowbird to participate in that evolutionary arms race with that baywing host. You can see here that the screaming cowbird fledglings are almost indistinguishable from baywing fledglings. However, cowbirds can also be generalists, parasitizing hundreds of species, like that shiny cowbird on the right does. This means that cowbirds, like the shiny cowbird, cannot evolve to look like the baywing, because then it wouldn't look like the other species too. When shiny cowbirds are raised in baywing nests, they are less likely to survive than when that mimic, the screaming cowbird, is raised in a baywing nest. In North America, our most ubiquitous obligate heterospecific brood parasite is the brown-headed cowbird, seen here looking positively dapper. When I say ubiquitous, I really mean it. Here's a photo I took of a big migratory cowbird flock in central Kansas a few years ago. It's a lot of cowbirds. Cowbirds are called cowbirds because they follow cows around pastures, eating insects stomped up by the cows. They were originally called bison birds because they did the same to roaming bison herds, as you can see from this photo I took in Kansas. This has led to a fun hypothesis that they evolved this breeding strategy because they were too busy following moving bison herds to stop and raise their own babies. However, recent evidence suggests cowbirds as a group evolved brood parasitism in Central America without bison and spread north from there, resulting in our brown-headed cowbirds. Also, recent evidence suggests that bison probably didn't move as much as we might assume, so the story falls apart on multiple fronts, but it is very fun. So let's explore these brown-headed cowbirds and their breeding biology. What makes them a villainous mobster in the eyes of so many biologists and birders? Cowbirds lay their eggs in the nests of at least 220 North American bird species, making them a generalist parasite like the shiny cowbird. That doesn't always work out for the baby cowbird, as the host parents may not be equipped to care for them. In Illinois, I saw cowbirds parasitizing housefinch nests, which never worked because housefinches do not feed their babies enough insects. The cowbirds ultimately starve to death. It turns out being a brood parasite requires some complicated planning. They must be able to find the host nests, and they need to find them at the right time, which means that the cowbird eggs must be laid around the same time that the host eggs are laid. If not, the cowbirds will develop and hatch after the host babies and will die because they'll be outcompeted by the hosts. So how do cowbirds accomplish this expert level egg laying? Well, we think that when they find a nest with eggs in it, they can gauge how far developed the embryos within those eggs are by poking a hole in one of the host eggs. If the egg is not too far along, not too developed, the cowbird knows she can lay her egg in that nest and it has a chance of surviving. If the eggs are too far along, the cowbird just leaves to find another nest, right? Wrong. If the eggs are too far developed, cowbirds may destroy the whole clutch. This forces the host parent to try again, building another nest, laying new eggs, and that gives a cowbird a chance to lay her eggs in the next nest. We call this behavior farming. The cowbirds are laying the seeds of their next parasitism attempt by ending the current nesting attempt. This farming behavior is not limited to the egg incubation stage. Cowbirds can also destroy whole broods of hatched host nestlings to force their parents to re-nest. I had hidden cameras out monitoring grassland bird nests in Kansas, and I captured this farming behavior at a dickcissel nest. I have that low-quality footage to share with you, but remember it does show a cowbird killing dickcissel babies, so you may want to look away for a second if you don't want to see that. Here we go. The cowbird comes to the nest, then tosses each baby dickcissel out onto the prairie ground, where they will die of exposure or be eaten by predators within hours, forcing that dickcissel mother to build a new nest that cowbird might be able to parasitize. If the cowbird manages to get an egg in the nest at the right time, the baby cowbird will grow up alongside its surviving host mates. They don't directly kill them like those cuckoos or those honey guides do. But cowbirds require a lot of food from the host parents, who are already at the most energy-intensive point in their year. Look at this poor male grasshopper sparrow. He has at least 3 caterpillars in his beak at once, trying to feed them to the hungry babies in his nest. This is costly for him, adding another hungry mouth to feed. The presence of cowbirds can also be costly for the host babies. Cowbirds are often larger and grow faster than their host nestmates. Here, I'm holding a cowbird on the right and a grasshopper sparrow on the left. You can see that the cowbird is substantially larger than that little sparrow nestmate. In extreme cases, cowbirds can outcompete the host babies, leading to their starvation, although I never witnessed that in these grassland birds. Even once they are old enough to leave the nest, cowbirds are still costly for host parents. Look at how large this cowbird fledgling is compared to the host common yellowthroat raising it. This yellowthroat is continuing to feed this cowbird, spending energy that could otherwise be dedicated to his own babies or to future nests. This cowbird parasitism is costly enough that hosts have evolved defenses. Yellow warblers respond to the presence of cowbird eggs in their nests by building a roof over the egg. Any warbler eggs that are already laid get buried as well, and then they start a new nest right on top of the old eggs. In this image on the left, you can see 4 little warbler eggs in the nest, and below it is a big cowbird egg buried. This cowbird egg will not be warmed enough by the incubating parent, will never hatch to outcompete the tiny warbler babies. I've also seen this egg-bearing behavior in sparrow and dickcissel nests in Kansas. Some host species have evolved to recognize cowbird eggs and throw them out of nests. American robins are expert cowbird egg rejectors. Why haven't all birds managed to evolve this egg rejection? I was taught that some species may be limited by their beak size and shape. They may be simply too small to remove a cowbird egg. That was a hypothesis for why grasshopper sparrows fail to remove cowbird eggs. However, here's footage I got at a sparrow nest. This big brown blob on the left of the frame is a male grasshopper sparrow, seen really close to the camera. He's about to reach into his nest. He does so, and he rolls out a cowbird egg. So it is definitely possible for him to remove the egg. However, if you could see through the blurry pixels, you may have noticed that there's a baby in the nest, begging for food behind that male bird. That is a cowbird baby. So this male is capable of removing cowbird eggs, but didn't. Why? One hypothesis is that cowbirds are, well, villainous mobsters. As you can see from this very real photo I took in Kansas. What do I mean by this? Well, some scientists think that cowbirds may check back in on their eggs and babies to see if the host parents have rejected them or didn't take good care of them. If that happens, this hypothesis holds that the cowbirds would then destroy the nest, including killing the host babies. That ensures that any host parent that comes up with some sort of innovative way to recognize a cowbird egg, to refuse the cowbird's young, to get rid of them, will not have any surviving babies that could inherit this new behavior. It prevents the evolution of anti-cowbird defenses. This hypothesis is called the mafia hypothesis. So far, scientists have not come up with convincing evidence of the mafia hypothesis in action. However, we have had some tantalizing clues. This is once again video I took of a cowbird killing nestlings. Once again, you might want to look away for a second. The female cowbird comes up to this nest, which has a grasshopper sparrow baby and a cowbird baby, and she kills them both. Presumably, this is not her own cowbird baby, but the baby of a competitor cowbird. When she empties the nest, you can see an unhatched cowbird egg left over. Is this just another example of farming behavior? Is she just forcing this grasshopper sparrow to make a new nest? Or did this cowbird retaliate because the parent grasshopper sparrow host did not manage to properly hatch her own egg? As if that isn't all enough, cowbirds have also expanded their range across the continent, coming into contact with more host victims. Traditionally a species of the open Great Plains, cowbirds expanded coast to coast when colonial settlers opened up the forests of North America, coming into contact with species that haven't evolved alongside these cowbirds. This expansion is relatively recent in terms of evolutionary history, at least. Cowbirds just reached Florida and Alaska 40 years ago. This expanded range has put cowbirds in contact with vulnerable and even endangered species, like the Kirtland's warbler and the black-capped vireo. Both species are not well equipped to deal with cowbird parasitism, and their host babies often die when cowbirds are in the nest out competing them. Researchers working to save both species therefore use these traps to kill adult cowbirds in the breeding range of the warblers and the vireos, a costly and labor-intensive solution to protect these species from extinction. So, are cowbirds villainous mobsters? I think you can argue that they are, and researchers have been compiling that evidence for decades. They poke holes in eggs and remove them to test the stage of the nest, reducing the number of babies that the host species can produce. They sometimes destroy whole nests in this farming behavior. They foist all of that costly parental care on the host parents who have to raise their voracious babies. Young cowbirds may outcompete host offspring, even killing them from starvation. They stress and overwork host parents, even after they have fledged the nest. If the mafia hypothesis is supported, they may even kill host nestlings if the cowbirds are not well taken care of, and they're expanding their range, impacting endangered species. Have I convinced you? Well, let's pivot to talk about why I give talks defending cowbirds as a falsely maligned native species and a good subject for biological research. When I first started giving this talk, I asked folks on Twitter, are cowbirds good? And surprisingly, most people who had an opinion said, yes, cowbirds are good. Of course, that could be a biased sample of the kind of people who follow a cowbird researcher online, but the most common response I got was this. We can't impose human moral standards on a non-human animal. Sure, cowbirds have evolved to do some behaviors that make us uncomfortable and definitely wouldn't fly in a human society, but that doesn't make them evil or bad. It's just nature. Plus, cowbirds are not the only birds that hurt other birds. Here's a Cooper's hawk, half of a pair, that built a nest right over the path at a popular park near me in Illinois. I watched them all spring, building their nest, incubating their eggs, raising their babies. Sometimes they fed their babies dead birds, including dead nestlings that they pulled out of nearby nests. Predators hurt other birds too, but we still enjoy them, and most North American birders wouldn't be advocating for destroying Cooper's hawk eggs. At least I hope they're not. I showed you this map highlighting how cowbirds have expanded their range in recent memory. However, that doesn't mean that cowbirds are non-native. There are fossil cowbirds on the East Coast, showing that they once lived across most of the continent, presumably when more of the continent was the open grassland that they prefer. They're more native than the introduced house finches at my feeders, yet I don't see many people advocating for killing those house finches. Cowbirds are a native bird, and like most of our native songbirds, their population sizes are declining. 0.6% per year may not seem like a lot, but over decades that adds up. On the left is a graph showing a decline in relative cowbird abundance in British Columbia, Canada. You may say that's not a bad thing, since cowbirds did not historically live in British Columbia. However, they did historically live in Missouri. You can see from the graph on the right that their populations are declining in Missouri as well. They're a native songbird, and like most native songbirds, they are in decline. Folks like that Twitter commenter tell me that cowbirds are neglectful or bad parents, but I take issue with that. Research suggests that female cowbirds could lay as many as 50 eggs in a breeding season, more than 5 times as many as most songbirds. That's a lot of nutrients that they need to invest in their babies. Not only that, but they have to make many complicated decisions to make sure that some of those babies survive. They need to find the nest, and as somebody who finds songbird nests for a living, I can tell you that's no easy task. They need to determine if it is the right host species and if the nest is sufficiently protected from predators and stable enough for their babies. They need to make sure that the nest is at the right stage in that early laying window when their eggs might survive. In my mind, they're good parents. They're just doing their parental care at a different life stage than other songbirds, in that pre-laying and laying window. The mafia hypothesis suggests that they're also checking back in on their nestlings to make sure they are okay. I've seen female cowbirds land on nests in my nest footage, look at the nestlings, and then take off. Was she checking on her baby, confirming it was fine? At the end of the day, I think we are too harsh on cowbirds. We can't impose human moral standards on a naturally evolved strategy. And after all, cowbirds are not the only bird that hurts other birds. They're a native species and they're in decline. We should be worrying for them, not worried about them. I also think that they're good moms that find nests, lay up to 50 eggs a year, check back in on their nestlings. I think that cowbirds are falsely maligned. Even if I haven't convinced you, I hope I can convince you that cowbirds are a very cool subject of biological research. Why might you research cowbirds? They can help us learn more about the host bird's biology. Conservation researchers could ask what the impact of cowbirds are on host species. Cognition or brain function researchers can ask how hosts recognize and respond to threats of parasitism. Physiology researchers who study the function of bodies can ask how these hosts perform anti-parasitism behaviors. Researchers studying animal communication can ask how hosts convey information about cowbird threats. In addition to studying the host birds, we can also study the cowbirds themselves. We can study their growth. How do baby cowbirds manage to grow up in so many different types of nests with host parents that have a variety of care styles? Cognition researchers can ask how cowbirds find and choose nests, and even how they figure out that they are cowbirds and not just some strange-looking host baby. Animal movement researchers can ask how cowbirds move around on a landscape to find nests. There are many, many more possible research questions, but these are all ones that me or my immediate lab mates and friends have studied in the last 5 years. So I just wanted to share examples from each of those projects. First, what is the impact of cowbirds on host species? When I first moved to Kansas, I was studying grasshopper sparrow males and how they arrange their territories on a landscape. Here's a map from May 2014. The warmer colors indicate higher densities of sparrows in that region of the prairie. Here's the same prairie a mere month later. You see that the birds have shifted, constantly moving their territories around on the landscape. I was exploring many hypotheses for why the sparrows might move, and one involved the possibility of extra pair paternity. In other words, sparrows cheating on their partner and having babies with a nearby female. To test this, I found that sparrow nests and took blood samples from the adults and the babies to run some DNA paternity analyses. I wanted to take blood samples from the babies when they were old enough that a quick little needle prick wouldn't hurt them, but not too old that they might leave the nest early. I settled on taking blood samples when they were 6 days old. However, all of the baby sparrows in these photos are 6 days old. The birds on the left are huge, look like they're almost ready to leave the nest. The birds in my hand are so much smaller. That led me to ask, why do grasshopper sparrow babies vary so much in size and growth patterns? I decided to make that the topic of my master's research. I expanded to 3 species total: eastern meadowlarks, dickcissels, and grasshopper sparrows. Does the growth rate of all of these species, babies, ultimately vary? I found their nests, I measured their babies every other day until they were old enough to fledge or leave the nest. Here is a graph of those data. On the bottom, or x-axis, is the age of the baby in days since it hatched. On the vertical, or y-axis, is the mass of the bird in grams, how much they weigh. Each line on the graph is the growth trajectory of a single baby, and the colors correspond to the species. Of course, meadowlarks weighed more than grasshopper sparrows or dickcissels, but look within the meadowlarks alone, within those purple lines. By day 9, some of those meadowlark babies were a mere 20 grams, while some were almost 60 grams. That means that some meadowlarks were 3 times the size of other meadowlarks on the same prairie at the same time of year. The dickcissel and the sparrow data got kind of squished in this graph because of the meadowlarks, but if I just showed you those, you'd see similar variation in their growth too. What could possibly give rise to so much variation in growth rate within each species? I tested some ecological variables like predator risk and food availability, but the site where I worked, Kansa Prairie Biological Station, a National Science Foundation property managed by Kansas State in Northeast Kansas, also has a ton of cowbirds. In fact, of any sparrow nests we found on the prairie, almost half of them were parasitized by cowbirds. And when they were parasitized, they were often really parasitized. The nest on the left is a dickcissel nest that should contain blue dickcissel eggs, but as you can see, it also contains 4 speckled cowbird eggs. The nest on the right is a dickcissel nest that should contain blue dickcissel eggs, but it is now all cowbird eggs. The host species are getting hammered by cowbird parasitism at this site. I hypothesized that brood parasitism, cowbird presence, would directly impact the growth rate if the cowbirds are outcompeting the host species. But parasitism could also be influencing food availability and predation risk, indirectly impacting host growth. What did my data show? I found no evidence of any significant environmental impact on growth rate, not even the presence of cowbirds. Which means that a sparrow growing up with a cowbird sibling who is 3 times bigger than that sparrow will not grow up slower than a sparrow with no cowbird sibling. It seems that the historic hosts of cowbirds, these grassland birds in the Great Plains, are capable of raising cowbirds with few consequences to the growth and development of their own nestlings within the nest. Unlike other hosts like the Kirtland's warbler seen here, babies often starve to death when cowbirds are competing with them. Which begs the question, who is paying the costs of raising these big cowbird babies? Perhaps the host parents are overworking themselves to feed all the babies in their nest, so their own babies don't see a cost. We're just not sure at this point. Next, what can cowbirds teach us about host cognition? In Illinois, I started working with American robins. As I mentioned, robins are expert cowbird egg rejectors. I never once saw a cowbird successfully fledge from a robin nest. What can we learn about robins by studying this egg rejection behavior? We learned that robins would not reject a 3D printed plastic egg as long as it was the right size and painted robin's egg blue. This nest has 4 real robin eggs and 1 fake egg up in the top left corner. However, robins don't just love anything egg-shaped and blue. If you paint a fake egg a darker blue, robins will reject it, but only about half of the time. Some females seem to be more likely to reject than others. Why? We can use this variation to study how robins think. Of course, robins always reject a plastic egg painstakingly painted to look like a cowbird egg. Here's a fake that we put in a robin's nest, and she immediately dumped on the ground. Since we want to explore how robins think, we asked if the presence of a fake cowbird egg would make them more suspicious of brood parasites nearby. If we put a fake cowbird egg in the nest, would they be more careful watching their eggs later? We tested it by giving the robin a cowbird egg, a fake one, which they always reject, or that robin's egg, blue egg, which they always accept. Then, the day after, we gave them that deep royal blue fake egg. The robins that saw and rejected the cowbird egg the day before were more likely to reject the deep blue egg than the robins that didn't think cowbirds were nearby. We learned that robins were able to assess the threat of brood parasitism and get more suspicious of weird-looking new eggs in their nests. This egg rejection behavior gives us the ability to test all sorts of questions about how robins perceive the world. For instance, how does a robin know when an egg is an egg and not some debris that fell into the nest? We printed strange angular and different sized 3D objects, painted them to look like robin eggs, and saw which ones the robins decided to incubate or throw out of the nest like it was trash. In fact, members of Dr. Mark Halber's lab, where I did my PhD, have tested robins with all sorts of sensory cues. Fake eggs with different scents, different spotting maculation patterns, different sizes, colors, shapes, different contrast for the background of the nest, different ratios of host eggs to parasite eggs, testing many different hypotheses about how robins perceive and understand the world based solely on their evolved cowbird defense mechanisms. We can also ask how hosts perform these behaviors. What about their bodies makes them more or less likely to defend their nests from cowbird parasitism? Dr. Abby Turner, who did her PhD in Dr. Mark Halber's lab while I was there, was curious why some robins reject the deep blue eggs, but other robins didn't. She wondered if the birds' stress levels impacted their willingness to reject eggs. She artificially increased their stress temporarily by putting a gel in the nest that contained the stress-associated hormone corticosterone. Robins who received a hormone-free gel were 50% likely to reject the blue eggs, but robins that received the hormones in the gel were much more likely to reject the eggs. This is evidence that stress could play a role in cowbird rejection behavior. What can cowbirds teach us about host communication? Yellow warblers have a special call that appears to mean that a cowbird is nearby. We call it the seat call, and when a laying female hears it, she rushes back to her nest and sits tight to physically prevent a cowbird from adding an egg to her nest by blocking the nest with her body. My colleague, Dr. Shelby Lawson, was studying these warblers, playing that seat call from a speaker to observe the warbler's behavior. What she didn't anticipate was that red-winged blackbird males would get extra aggressive when they heard that call, but not other yellow warbler calls. Dr. Lawson did some follow-up experiments that supported her hunch that red-winged blackbirds seem to understand that that warbler call means cowbird nearby, and they respond by showing up to chase the cowbird away. Yellow warblers and red-winged blackbirds may therefore be working together in a sense to protect both of their nests from cowbird parasitism. You can also research the cowbirds themselves. How do they grow in that many different host environments? Red-winged blackbirds are larger than cowbirds, and song sparrows are smaller, but both raise cowbirds. Does cowbird growth differ between these two host species? Here on the bottom x-axis is again the cowbird age in days, and the mass in grams on the vertical y-axis. The cowbirds that grew in the sparrow nests, seen in the dotted line, grew faster and reached larger sizes than the cowbirds that grew in the larger, more competitive blackbird nests. My colleague, Dr. Nick Antonsen, studied cowbirds growing in the nests of prothonotary warblers. He wondered if cowbird babies could actively change their developmental circumstances to promote more favorable growth conditions. Nick had first noticed that in experiments where the brood size, the number of prothonotary warbler babies in the nest with the cowbird, were controlled, cowbird survival varied with brood size. Here on the bottom x-axis, we have 3 experimental treatments: 0 warbler babies, 2 warbler babies, and 4 warbler babies. On the vertical y-axis, we have the probability of cowbird survival. 0 at the bottom means the cowbird would likely die. 1 at the top, likely to survive. And we see that they are likely to survive if there are 2 warbler nestmates. With 0 warblers in the nest, the host parents were more likely to abandon the remaining cowbird or let it starve. With 4 warblers in the nest, the parents could not meet all the baby's needs. The cowbird was the most likely to survive with 2 warbler nestmates in a sort of Goldilocks zone. Not too few, not too many, just right. Could cowbird babies actively put themselves in this Goldilocks zone? Nick fostered babies into 4 types of artificial broods: 2 warblers and a cowbird, the ideal combination for that cowbird; 3 warblers with no cowbird, so the same amount of bodies, no cowbird; 4 warblers with a cowbird, or 5 warblers with no cowbirds. Then he counted how many warbler babies did not survive to fletch. The number that died are on the vertical y-axis. In the first 2 treatment groups, most of the warblers survived. Having that cowbird did not lead to any more warbler deaths than there would be with 3 warbler babies, no cowbirds present. If there were 5 warblers, the parents were still able to keep up and were not more likely to have babies die in that treatment either. However, if there were 4 warblers, so many that it risked the cowbird's survival, the cowbird in that treatment outcompeted the warblers, so that on average, 2 warblers died, bringing that cowbird to its ideal Goldilocks zone again of 2 warblers and a cowbird. It looks like in this system, the cowbirds can use competition to actively manipulate the brood in their favor. How exactly does a cowbird even understand it's a cowbird? Why doesn't it think that its parents are the host parents raising it? It turns out baby cowbirds do seem to think that the host parents are their real parents, and at some point in their life, they need to suddenly learn that they are a cowbird that needs to seek out other cowbirds to find a breeding partner. Dr. Haber, my PhD advisor, hypothesized during his own PhD that adult cowbirds provide some sort of a password that unlocks the baby cowbird's identity. Further research since has shown that this hypothesis is true. Cowbirds, adults give this call that we call a chatter call. And when baby cowbirds hear that chatter call, it alters gene expression in their brain, making them suddenly aware that they're a cowbird. This has led to questions about how juvenile cowbirds move around the landscape. How do they find other cowbirds to be with them in a flock? Research has shown that in some areas, cowbird babies may sneak out of the nest at night, perhaps seeking other cowbirds. My colleague, Mac Chamberlain, is working on his PhD research, studying the movement, tracking baby cowbirds. He also located large roosts with thousands of cowbirds aggregating overnight for protection and socialization. Some of the birds that Mac tagged in Illinois have been picked up by radio towers run by researchers in Kansas, suggesting that adult cowbirds may move across the continent in the middle of the breeding season. Do they potentially parasitize species in multiple states? We're not sure. This is just a snapshot of the many topics you could study with cowbirds, just the work of my close friends. Even if you don't like cowbirds, I hope you appreciate that they can be fascinating research subjects. But even if you don't like them, you don't think the research is cool, I'll leave you with one final thought, returning to this Audubon article that asks if it's okay to remove cowbird eggs from host eggs. There's a reason that the subtitle says you should leave tampering to the prose. Many reasons, in fact. If you've never thought of tossing a cowbird egg out of a nest, you may be asking why this even comes up. I did another not very scientific Twitter poll asking if folks would consider removing an egg. And a handful of people, 7.6%, said yes. And remember, my followers on this site likely followed me because I researched cowbirds, so this is probably an undercount. That's a lot of dead, declining native cowbird eggs. It's a bad idea to remove cowbird eggs. First of all, they are a native species in decline already, and they are protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. It is illegal to harm these birds without a permit. But also, it's not a good idea for the host birds either. Going near a nest stresses out those host parents, altering their behavior. It can even lead them to abandon their nest. Taking this photo of this dickcissel nest presumably stressed out the parents, which is why I only approach nests for research that I've cleared with the Animal Care and Use Board, not just for photography. Birds count their eggs, and when an egg disappears from their nest, they may think that a predator is nearby, like this speckled king snake about to eat these dickcissel and cowbird eggs. Some small snakes only eat one egg at a time, but will return on subsequent days to eat more. Parents may think that a disappearing egg means that a predator has come to the nest, and that investing further time in raising those babies is pointless. They might abandon the nest and try again somewhere else. If the mafia hypothesis is supported and cowbirds retaliate against hosts that remove their eggs, your removing a cowbird egg could lead to the cowbirds returning and destroying that nest. This is why even when cowbirds are being removed to protect endangered species, researchers do not remove the eggs, but rather kill the adult cowbirds with permits to prevent further parasitism. And if none of that can convince you, just remember that I really like cowbirds. They perch on my finger when I measure them. I feel like a Disney princess. I would be super bummed to know that people who like birds are killing a native bird. That's all I have. Here's my contact information again if you want to reach out. I'm happy to take any questions you may have.